chapter 19. Chapter 19, according to my notes, we finished the 8th chapter last week. This is right down to the end of the ministry. However, John has a way of kind of dragging things out here just a bit, because we've been in the final week since chapter 13. So the last several chapters leads up to, in fact, the final night. John spends more time than any of the other Gospels. But John's written last. The Synoptic Gospels already give us a lot of detail, and John is going to repeat some of that, but you can kind of tell that from his vantage point, he's not going to repeat a lot of the things that the Synoptics have already told us. So he's going to give us a little bit more of an insight to some things that he wants to focus on, and we know at the end of the book what he really wants to focus on. Main purpose of his writing, or I have to be careful how I say this, but he does want to present Jesus' ministry so that people might better understand him. And John takes a perspective of people who don't have Jewish background and wouldn't know about this, so he's very concerned to present Jesus in that way. But at the end of his gospel, he makes this point. These things have been written in order that you might believe that Jesus is Christ, Son of the living God, and in believing have life in his name. So it's all about not just, here are the facts, here's history, here's what happened, because you can know history really well and die in your sins. So it's like, here's what happened, and here's how you ought to accept that. Here's what you ought to think about that. Here's the impact that ought to have in your life. He wants to explain this word faith, what it means to believe. Okay, I say that again. We've said that several times, but I say that again because we're focusing on a Roman governor. What's this Roman governor's name that we've been dealing with? Pilate. We get a lot of information about Pilate, but John really seems to look at Pilate not just as a historical figure, here's what happened in the trial. He seems to look at it from the vantage point of let's crawl inside Pilate's head a little bit. Let's look at this from a personal perspective, because John's all about belief, the right kind of belief. And I don't know, I think Pilate's a great example of somebody who had every opportunity, probably went through the cognitive process and came out the other side not believing. Well, it's a classic example of somebody who missed it. And so I think both, you want to look at the positive examples, but you also want to look at the negative examples, right? So a little bit later, we've been mentioning Judas as the betrayer, and we've dripped a little bit of water on that as he's brought up. But when we look at Peter at the end, because he betrayed Jesus as well, again, we're going to be able to put side by side. Here's two men, went through the same thing, same tragedy. One came back, one didn't. Well, Pilate's an example of somebody who had every opportunity, but made the wrong decision. Chapter 19, verse 1, Pilate then took Jesus and scourged him, flogged him. This flogging, unfortunately, we know a lot about this flogging. How many of you remember watching I'm surprised people have never seen this, but the Passion of the Christ? Has anybody not seen that movie? I know there's some people, like my wife, for example, never wants to see it. No editorial comment. I'll try my best to. At first, how many years ago did that come out? It's been out for quite some time.
20-some years.
Has it been that long?
I think it was in the 90s. I could be wrong, but I'm thinking it was.
Okay, longer than I thought. But I tell you, there are several things in that movie that I was going to say to our generation, but it's been out that long. It's a little dated now. But it kind of visualizes, helps us better understand. That scourging scene, I think, was actually, it was very graphic, but it wasn't graphic enough. It wasn't graphic enough. Yeah.
Yeah, I got to listen to, this was from the 70s of all things, but it was a Christian comedian of all things too.
Yes.
But he got to talking about the crucifixion and the death, and he got real serious, and he described scourging based on, I guess, whatever we have historically, and some of the things he talked about, all these little strands on the end of the, and
Sometimes referred to as nine tails.
yeah, and glued on were bits of pottery and glass and all kinds of sharp things. And so when they swung it, it would catch and wrap around somebody, and then they would twist.
It would dig in the flesh.
And then they would twist the straps and just let it all.
Yes.
Yeah, and just really graphically explained in this particular audio I heard. It was really tough to listen to.
Yeah. Well, one of my memories of the Holy Land trip we took, they took us to some places where they thought this might have happened. We know these are places that the Romans occupied around Jerusalem, and they talked about it. I'm always a very visual person, but it just helps me to see. Because the way they represented it in the movie, if memory serves me, he was tied to a post. Well, that's acceptable. That could have been one of the things. But they showed us, again, this has been years ago, but they showed us a section of that they had dug up, that the archaeologists had discovered where the Romans were. And they said, in this particular place, if this where it had taken place, instead of it being a pillar, they had two pillars, and they would have stretched his body out. And so he would have been tied so he couldn't pull away. One of the things I really appreciated about that movie, I don't know how much you remember this because it's been out such a long time ago, but the scourging, the flogging of Jesus, one of the things I tip my hat to him because poetic license, sometimes guys do stuff to the historical record that really bothers me. But one of the things I really appreciated that Gibson did was during the flogging, do you remember this? When the Roman looked like, okay, I'm done. And it's as though Jesus mustered all his strength and took a deep breath and pulled himself back up as though to say, no, you're not done yet. I can take more. I really think there's some validity to having that view. And one of the reasons I think of that, I don't know that we'll get that part tonight, but here in the 19th chapter, Jesus said, I thirst. I thirst. Well, there were two different drinks offered to Jesus. One he refused and one he took. The one he refused, do you remember that? The first drink that was offered to him? The reason, I think the best explanation that I've read as to why he refused that drink, because the only difference between that drink and the vinegar wine that they offered him later, the only difference would be that gall or myrrh was mixed with it, which was supposed to have a pain dulling effect to it. And I don't understand all those things. I just know my mom used to give me clove gum. And I discovered that dentists used to use cloves all the time because you put it in your mouth and guess what? It helps. It really does help. No, so I know they have things like that, but when Jesus tasted it, knew what it was, he refused it. I think that's along the lines of I don't want to dull any of the pain. I want to take the full 100% of the pain that's being offered.
The U.S. release date of that movie was February 25th, 2004.
2004. Thank you. I don't feel quite as old. I still feel old.
17
So it's been out 15 years. Okay.
Wow.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, the flogging, the only thing I'd add to that, and again, I don't want to get too graphic here, but I think it's worth exploring this. The Bible does not spend a lot of time other than just, as a matter of fact, just put it out there. He had him flogged. And then all the gospel accounts, he was crucified. And they don't go into the gory details. And I think there's reason for that because I think it's easy to get focused just on the physical aspect. So I don't want to do that too much, but I don't want to ignore it either because I think part of this is they just put it as a matter of fact because everybody in that day knew it. The Romans not only made a fine art out of crucifixion, they were known during rebellions to crucify people and put them on the major thoroughfares. So everybody would see it. So this crucifixion thing and the flogging and stuff, it was in your face. So it's some of the gruesome kind of stuff that you probably didn't want to remember, but Rome just put it right there. Okay, so one more thing I would throw out there, though, is Josephus is a Jewish historian that tells us that the Roman floggings, many times people didn't survive the Roman floggings. And one of the things that he tells us is that sometimes so much flesh was removed that internal organs would fall out. Well, just that statement boy, my visuals just go boom on that one. And I could well understand, if they take so much muscle away that your colon falls out, I don't know how you could live much longer, right? Obviously, it didn't happen that way with everybody, but it was that kind of a thing, wrap around your body, ripping loose, and a lot of people didn't survive it. Okay, here's the point. Pilate knew he was innocent. Pilate knew he didn't deserve to be crucified, so he flogs him. Okay, I know I'm repeating myself, but I've just got to say this. He's the guy in the position, he's the governor, he has to make the call. He knows the guy's innocent. So let's just punish him a little bit. The call is either he's guilty or he's innocent. So if you know he's innocent, don't do anything to him. So this is all the political pressure here, and he's trying to appease them. So since we're trying to get in Pilate's mind just a little bit, I really think that's part of the purpose here. Step number one, you try to avoid the conflict. This has nothing to do with me. You guys handle it yourself. But you can't avoid the conflict. So you try to negotiate. Well, that doesn't work. These guys aren't budging. So you try to appease. But you try to appease by doing something you know is wrong. Because you're trying to avoid something more wrong. And then you finally end up doing the thing that you know you shouldn't do. And you still try not to take the guilt. You wash your hands and say, yeah, it's not really my fault. The reason I think all these steps are worth thinking is people tend to rationalize, justify, go through all the process. I couldn't help it, the pressure, I didn't want to, wasn't my fault. At the end of the day, if you did something, guess what? You did something. So maybe people put pressure on you. Maybe you didn't want to. Maybe you're just trying to make people happy. I think all that's worth thinking about with Pilate because, and maybe I'm wrong in this, but I think a lot of people feel sorry for Pilate. Sure. Especially if you just read through this too quickly. We shouldn't feel sorry for Pilate. A little bit of background. I read a little bit more about Pilate today, and just really interesting stuff because he had, we don't know much about his relationship with Tiberius, with the Caesar at this time, other than towards the very end of Pilate's career, he was called back to Rome, and it looked like he was going to be in a whole lot of trouble, but before he got to Rome, Tiberius died. And so we never know just how much trouble he got into. But the reason he got into trouble is because of Jews. So here he's trying to appease the Jews. Boy, isn't there a lesson there? The very people you try to bend over and please, at the end of the day, they're the very people who end up taking his position away from him. Okay, but one of the things I did want to bring up, though, it's not so much Rome. He has a history. There's at least 3 major events that we know of from different historical documents that point to relationship problems he had with the Jews. So we know very little about Pilate outside the Bible, but what we do know about Pilate was a lot of trouble with the Jews. In fact, one of the stories, I'll try to make this brief, but one of the stories is he came to Jerusalem, one of the first times he came to show Roman force. When they came in, they would have Tiberius's image on their uniforms and especially on their on the standards that they carried. Well, the Jews found that very offensive. And so the previous governors had always acquiesced to the Jewish belief, and when they came in, they wouldn't, emblazon those banners that were showing Caesar is God, right? They wouldn't do that just so they wouldn't offend the Jews. But Pilate's like, we're Rome, we're going to do whatever we want. And he found out the hard way that when you butt heads with the Jews, because this is a kind of relationship where the Jews complained to Caesar about how he was doing his job. And he had gotten in trouble with the Jews before. Probably a little bit of the background why he's so concerned to appease them on this occasion. Okay, so that's verse 1, sorry.
Yeah.
Pilate has him flogged. I don't want to brush by that because there's no reason the governor, and he has no evidence for this yet, does he? None at all. In fact, while I'm thinking about that, turn back to chapter 18. Look down at verse 38. Have you got that? John chapter 18, verse 38. What is truth? Retorted Pilate. With this he went out again to the Jews gathered there and said, look at the statement at the end of the 38th verse, I find no basis for a charge against him. Now look down in chapter 19, verse 4. Look, I'm bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him. That's verse 4. Look down at verse 6. They're saying, crucify, crucify. But Pilate answered, you take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him. In this back and forth, remember last week, we said Pilate goes in and out 7 times. That's a sign of a panic-stricken person. Instead of just standing there and taking care of it, he's going back and forth. He's trying to appease. And 3 different times in these short verses. There's nothing here. There's nothing here. There's nothing. But he hasn't flogged anyway. Verse 2. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and a purple robe on him. They're doing this to mock. Usually when we think of the mocking of Jesus, especially from fulfilled prophecy, Psalm 22, where it talks about them mocking him. It tells us what they're going to say. He trusts in God. Let God deliver him. Well, that would be the mocking of the Jewish religious leaders that took place on the cross. Well, there was more mocking than that. And this is the mocking of the soldiers. They put the crown of thorns to make fun of him here. They put the purple robe. The reason that one really gets me, have we talked about this before? Purple. Whoa. Purple's associated with royalty. So, of course, they want to put a purple robe on him to mock him. Right? Here's the king. But the thing that's so shocking about this is the reason purple's associated with royalty. Why is that?
Very expensive.
Very expensive. And I never remember this. People look this up for me all the time. But in the ancient world, the only way you get purple was from, was it a snail? Okay, oyster, whatever. It took like 10,000 oysters or snails or whatever it was. It took like 10,000 of them to get just a couple drops. So many people who were extremely wealthy, sometimes even royalty, when they wore a purple robe, it would only be the hem of the garment that was purple. Because you couldn't afford, the royalty couldn't afford to have the whole thing purple. That's how terribly expensive it was. So I understand the crown of thorns, but what's with putting a $10,000 suit on him to make fun of him? Because even $10,000 suits get old. Right? So this is probably a discarded old one. It was probably kept somewhere because it was purple. Right? But nonetheless, it fits because they want to mock the fact that he's king. Verse 3, and they began to come up to him and say, Hail, King of the Jews, in obviously a very mocking manner, and to give him slaps on the face. By the way, when you look at Isaiah, you look at some of the prophecies associated with the mocking that Jesus received, the Old Testament tells us that during the mocking, they also ripped his beard out.
Yeah.
don't have a beard anymore. But I can just imagine, you know.
Did one of the Gospels talk about a staff and they used it to hit him on the head with those thorns, or is that just something I saw?
Yeah. I'm not remembering that part. But the slapping of him and the what John describes here and with the prophecies too, yeah, it was mainly meant to make fun of and humiliate, but there was very painful too. Especially when you have the ripping out of the beard, but the slapping of the face. Sometimes they would do things like this. The soldiers were known for doing things like this to try to get somebody to confess to something. You know, they did it not just to have fun, but they did it to try to get them to say something. Because under those kind of, it's torture. You know, under torture, people usually say things they usually don't say. But there's no indication that they're looking for additional information because Pilate already knows this guy's innocent. This is just the soldiers having a free run. Verse 4, Pilate came out again and said to him, "Behold, I am bringing him out." Okay, I'm taking too long to say this, but back in verse 1, what did he do? Had him flogged. Okay, just from what little we talked about, what would a flogged person look like?
Bloody, pretty messed up.
Yeah, wow, this guy almost died. So to bring him out, instead of just talking this time, he brings him out. Probably, I think a lot of commentators are probably accurate about this. He's probably trying to use the pity card. He's trying to get out of doing something that he knows he shouldn't do. So he brings him out so that you may know I find no guilt in him. But he had him flogged anyway. Verse 5. Jesus then came out wearing the crown of thorns in the purple robe. Wow. I know they're intending for this to be a mocking thing to put him down. But I can't help to think of the double meaning associated with it. He comes out, the crown of thorns, the purple robe, and Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." This is kind of it's a very famous statement that he makes. It's just from Pilate's perspective. I don't want to prejudice your thinking here, but why do you think Pilate said this? How's he dressed?
Royalty.
Yeah, like a royalty, like you're making so much fun of the fact that he's not royalty. And so when Pilate says this, you know, I find no guilt in this man, we need to. Why do they want him crucified? What are the charges here? What are the charges that Pilate's going to listen to? They're concerned about their own power and position.
Right. They say it's insurrection.
Insurrectionists. So he's leading a campaign to be a king. And obviously he's making the point, no, he's not. Yeah. So when he says the man, what does Pilate in essence say? He's just a man. Just a man. That's exactly right. Yeah, not only not the Son of God, but because I'm not so sure Pilate would care about that as a Roman governor. But he's not a leader. He's not a king. That'd be Pilate's perspective. But do you remember when Caiaphas made the statement that don't you guys realize it's better that one person die than we lose the whole nation? He meant let's kill this guy so we can keep our position of authority. But what it really meant, he was prophesying as high priest that year. What did it really mean? The death of this one man's actually going to bring life to the nation. It's through by his wounds we are healed. It's through his death you and I receive forgiveness of sins. So it had this double meaning, right? And wow, what a powerful double meaning. This statement, I think appropriately, is focused on because when Pilate says, "Behold the man," he had one thing in mind. It's not a king or whatever. But God's using this to say, here is the quintessential man. Here's the only man who's ever been what a man should be. He's the perfect man. He's the only man who could die for all humanity. Behold, here he is, the man. I think this is a powerful thing that's going on here. Verse 6, after saying that, after presenting him, so the chief priests and the officers saw him and cried out. They saw him being mocked, right? They saw him just being flogged. it hasn't reduced their anger, their animosity at all. Instead, they cried out, "Crucify, crucify." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourself and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." It's the third time he says this. And the Jews answered, "We have a law, and by that law he ought to die because he made himself out to be the Son of God." Okay. Does Pilate care about religious issues? No. Okay, so they, in a sense, they tipped their hand. Not really, because the real reason they're doing this, what's the real reason they're trying to kill Jesus? Yes. Yes. I think we have every indication that they know that they are turning on an innocent man. In fact, they are paying people to falsely testify against him, right? So they know what they're doing, but still they're doing it.
Well, Pilate knows it too.
Yes.
He already made that clear. He knew it was out of jealousy and so forth.
Yes.
He had a better handle on it than they did.
Good. Okay, so their true motive is very selfish. It's very power-oriented, and they know they're doing wrong. But how they justify this in their own minds, I'm guessing in their own minds, at least with their own people, is, hey, blasphemy. You know, we don't need to hear anything else. The high priest rips his clothes. Why? Because he admitted he's the Son of God, right? And so that's the real charge, but that's not going to work with Pilate, right? So what do we have to say with Pilate? That it's a matter of loyalty to Caesar.
Right.
Okay, so that's the political thing we can use, but they slipped here. You know, this is not something that's going to make a difference, but they slipped. This is so interesting. Why is John including this? Because what happens when they say this? He makes himself out to be, because he claims to be the Son of God. Therefore, verse 8, when Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. Okay, this shouldn't make any difference to him. But it's really bothering him. This has nothing to do with his legal decision, but it's like, what? Okay, what do we know about Mrs. Pilate?
Yeah.
Yeah, and what was her advice to Pilate?
Had nothing to do with it.
Don't have anything to do with him. I've been tormented through my dreams because of him. And then when he hears this, when he hears what's really going on. So again, I think John's giving us a little bit of insight into what's going on inside Pilate. More than uneasy, he's afraid. To hear about this, verse 9, he entered again to the praetorium and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" Okay, 3 times he's already interrogated and said, "I find no fault with him." But here he comes back again. And why? He's afraid. He needs to know a little bit more. So he asked him where he's from, and Jesus gave no answer. Why would Jesus give no answer?
Full prophecy.
Okay, it does fulfill prophecy. It's exactly right. Like a sheep, this is Isaiah 53. Right. However, Jesus does talk to Pilate. He's going to talk to him a little bit. But he stays quiet here. And by the way, why was that prophesied about Jesus? Why is that so important that Jesus be quiet during his trial?
Because he doesn't want to be exonerated.
Yes. You wouldn't be able, and John makes this point, I think, more graphically than all the other gospel writers. They wouldn't be able to crucify him if it weren't for the fact that Jesus handed himself over. Remember how they came to get him with over 600 soldiers in the garden? He makes it very clear, I am he, and they all fall down. They couldn't have taken him away unless he was willing to go.
But he could out-argue them anyway.
Yes.
They never could outsmart him.
Yes.
So in a court, he'd probably win.
Yes, and early on, before the official interrogation took place, whether at Annas' house, that's one of the points he makes to him. He said, I've said everything publicly. It's kind of like he's saying, my life's an open book. Let's deal with the facts, if you want to deal with the facts. So enough has been said even during the trial, but he keeps his mouth shut. I agree with that. It's fulfilled prophecy. I think part of the reason the prophecy's there is because he's handing himself over. He's allowing this to happen. We're going to see that all the way through the crucifixion. He is totally in control, clear up to the end when he says it is finished and gives up the spirit. In total control all the way to the end. Okay? But in addition to that, keeps his mouth shut, doesn't say anything at this point because maybe he knows Pilate enough to know he wouldn't understand. Yeah?
More, but from what you just said, he's totally in control, and I think, well, what an example of what meek is. So often we have trouble, defining it. We almost, it's like, well, here's a good example of what it means to be meek.
Yes. Yeah, boy, I'll say, that's so true. It is so true. Okay, there's a sense in which Pilate wouldn't understand. There's also a sense in which Jesus has already given us enough information. And it does fulfill prophecy, and he is in control, and he is handing himself over by remaining quiet. But Pilate comes back and won't let this go. So obviously, I think this shows us a little bit more how Pilate is really troubled. So Pilate said to him, you do not speak to me? Do you not know that I have the authority to release you, and I have the authority to crucify you? What kind of statement is Pilate mentioned here? I'm in charge here. Oh, you got that one. You got that one. Okay, why would you make a statement like that if you're so troubled? If you're so scared to death, why would you make a statement like that?
It's also saying, give me a reason to let you go. Speak to me, give me a reason to let you go.
Okay.
He's scared enough that he didn't really want to do it.
Okay. Yes. Sometimes people who have are very afraid, have very weak self-esteem issues, come across very boisterous and very loud, as if this is the kind of person I want to be, and just state it so strong. But Pilate is trying to take control of the situation, but notice how Jesus responds here. Again, I find this so insightful. Jesus answered in verse 11, you would have no authority over me unless it had been given you from above. Wow. You would have no authority over me unless it had been given from above. Is there a sense in which God gave Pilate his authority? In what sense? How did Pilate get his authority from God? Romans chapter 13 says that God ordained, God authorized governing authorities. That very passage, that doesn't mean every government God's happy with. Obviously, there are a lot of governments that have murdered millions of people and done all sorts of terrible things. That very passage, Romans 13 chapter, where it says God ordains governing authorities, he specifies why.
Punish those who
To punish the evildoer and make it possible for the just person to live a peaceful life. The people who do right ought to be encouraged to live right because government's doing its job. And the people who do wrong ought to be scared to death to do wrong because government's doing its job.
Yeah.
That's what I'm talking about. Because it seems to me a lot of times government's more concerned about the rights of the evildoer than the innocent. And that's exactly opposite of what God ordained governing authorities for. Okay, knowing what it says in Romans 13, purpose of God ordained government. What does that mean about Pilate right here? God has given you a job, Pilate. You're supposed to punish the evildoer and you're supposed to set the innocent people free. That's the authority you've been given. It's not what's happening. No authority, you'd have no authority over me unless it be given to you from above. For this reason, he who delivered me to you has the greater sin. Who handed Jesus over to Pilate? Jews. I'm really focused on this phrase because I think this is very important. When he says guilty of a greater sin, are some sins greater than other sins?
Yes.
That's what this sounds like, doesn't it? Okay. James chapter 1 talks about sin, and sometimes I think that creates some confusion. What does James chapter 1 tell us about sin? Just one sin. It does not say one sin's like every other sin. Sometimes it's misinterpreted that way. What does it say though?
Isn't the result the same?
Yeah, one sin makes you a sinner. Breaking one law makes you a lawbreaker. So you're in the same category with everybody else. Doesn't mean it's the same amount of guilt. It just means you are guilty like everybody else. That's the point that James makes. The only person who's outside that arena is the perfect person. Yeah. So we're all lawbreakers. But Jesus, I think, makes an important point here because the Bible does make a distinction. There are some sins that are worse than other sins. I mean, just think about it. There are some sins that involve a whole lot more people and affect a lot of other people as well as yourself, right? So there are different kinds of sins. But I want to go back up too before I leave this verse when he talks about you wouldn't have any authority unless it had been granted to you. Therefore, for this reason, those who deliver me to you are guilty of a greater sin. So there is a greater sin, but who is it? It's the Jews. In what sense do the Jewish leaders have authority granted to them?
They were the same. They were the chosen ones.
Yeah. It's one thing for Pilate, because he's a governing authority. He's supposed to punish the evildoer. He's supposed to make it possible for those who live right to do so in peace. But the Jewish leadership, if anybody should know God's will and what should be and shouldn't be, and yet they are deliberately going against it for their own personal account. And that's part of the reason why they are guilty of a greater sin. They know more. They definitely should know a lot more. Verse 12, as a result of this, Pilate made efforts to release him. What's he done so far? Yeah, logic, negotiation, flogged him. Who's Barabbas?
The insurrectionists?
Yeah, let me give you this. Let one of them go, use the cultural. So he tries to use an out here. The out that he uses doesn't work. Nothing has worked to this point. But it says he still makes efforts to release him. But the Jews cried out, saying, if you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Okay, this is where some of the historical background comes in. Because he's gotten in trouble before, not because he's not willing to confront the Jews, but the Jews tell Caesar on him. And it's gotten him into trouble before, and it's going to get him in trouble later, so we know he feels the pressure there. You're no friend of Caesar. Everyone who makes himself out to be a king opposes Caesar. Who's saying this?
Yeah, the Jews.
Yeah, what did they say before about not being slaves to anyone? They've always been free. Never served anyone. They're going to make an outrageous statement in just look down at the end of verse 15. The chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. Yeah, that's the epitome of how far people will go sometimes. Okay. Anyway, they put this pressure on me. You're no friend of Caesar. He's making himself out to be a king. They've already tipped their hand on why they're really doing this. Pilate, by the way, knows that. Matthew tells us he knows it's out of envy that they're doing all this, but he still has to deal with their reporting back to Caesar, so he feels pressure. So in verse 13 it says, therefore when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. And the word just means ridge or height, but it's the official place where judgments are made. So he comes out to make this judgment. Now I'm very curious as to your translation here. When it says that Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down. That sounds like he brings Jesus out and then he sits in the official place where the governor is supposed to sit to make the official pronouncement. Do any of your translations give it a different flavor? Is that the way it sounds like in your translation?
Mine's the same, for the judge's seat.
Okay, that's probably the way it ought to be translated. That's a good translation. But it is possible, and I just find this fascinating. It's possible. That was for dramatic effect. It's possible that when he brought him out, what's he look like?
Yeah, king.
Yeah, they've got him dressed up like a king. it's possible that when he says he brought him out, you can say, and sat him down.
Yeah. Church thing.
That would give me chills, because it's like, not only is he presented as king, he's the king in the judgment seat. Wow. Probably not. It's probably Pilate bowing to the pressure here. But nonetheless, that's a possibility. In the judgment seat.
It does, my translation says when Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down with the judges. So he sat down. So
Right.
Jesus was probably being carried out, but he probably could walk.
Barely. But Jesus is going to be able to carry part of his cross before somebody else has to carry it the rest of the way. So yes. Now it's the day of preparation, is verse 14. What is the day of preparation? Yeah, preparation day is the day before the Sabbath day, so that'd be Friday. This is the Passover week. It's the day of preparation for the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. About the 6th hour. Again, do any of your translations say so?
6 a.m.
Okay, if you're telling time the way that I think John does most consistently, the Jewish way, remember how every day has 12 hours in it, regardless how long? So the 6th hour would be noon, right? The Roman way of telling time, this would be 6 o'clock in the morning.
But it would have been early in the morning that this all started. So I'm just wondering how long. It's possible it could be noon by now.
It's possible it could be noon.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, we've got no problem with the flexibility if John were the only one writing, but we have other gospel records. And over in Mark, it says that it was 9 o'clock in the morning. It's be Mark chapter 15, verse 25. So it's 9 o'clock in the morning that this happened. That's why it's important to see the way John said this. It doesn't make any difference. If he goes back to Roman way of keeping time, which a lot of people think that's what he's talking about, and everything took place really early in the morning. And so all this proceeding was taking place early. That is a possibility. I don't think that's what's going on. I think the emphasis here is he's just saying about. He's not trying to locate the time.
He says about noon.
Yeah.
In my translation.
Okay. The point he's making is it's still early in the day on
It
preparation.
wouldn't start until sunset anyway.
That's exactly right.
It doesn't start till sunset.
And Mark on this occasion is being more specific. It takes place before noon, be 3 hours earlier, but John is just giving us approximation here when he says about. And he said to the Jews, behold your king. That's another reason why, yes, it's probably he's sitting there making this official judgment, but realizing that the grammar, it's possible that he sat Jesus down there and said, behold your king. Yes.
Sorry, I can go back.
Okay.
When, I don't know if you looked at the original translation, but from the original, does it actually translate to it was about? Because if he said about, then my question is, all this was written down with the help of the Holy Spirit.
Yes.
Breathe, if you will. Why would he use a word like about? He needs more specifics.
No, very, very good. I'm glad you say this, because there are times when God wants to focus on some specific things, and he'll say that. But God can use the word about when he's just talking about things in general. And so he's not focused on the time here. And the way John's presenting this, it is in the original Greek. This is not an insertion by the translators here. And so he's just giving us the general time of day, because that's not the vantage point that John's using here. I think he's trying to give us a personal flavor, not lay out the facts for us. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Is it possible that the purpose of mentioning the time, whether it's before noon or at noon, that the Jews are kind of, we got to get this wrapped up because they don't want to be defiled. So they need to get this over with so they can get on with the Passover.
Yeah. From 9 o'clock in the morning until 3 o'clock in the afternoon, because they want to take care of him and bury him before the sun sets.
I would think that would be the main reason the time would even be given.
In crucifixion, they want him crucified. Crucifixion usually took a long time. It usually took a long time. But he had been flogged, which is going to speed it up. Okay, So he said to the Jews, behold your king. So they cried out, away with him, crucify him. I'm reading out the New American Standard. When it's italicized, they're inserting that. So they're just saying away, away. Yeah, I think it's okay when they add the pronoun here. Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? He's not giving this up, is he? It's kind of like he already knows he's going to give it. He's going to do what they pressured him to do. So he's going to dig him all the way, right? So it's your king. You want me to crucify your king? And the chief priest answered, we have. Yeah, we have no king but Caesar. So he then handed him over to them to be crucified. This is where Pilate really caves. This is the decisive verse because he's the only one who can make this decision. And if you feel sorry for Pilate, focus on this verse. Because regardless of all the pressure, he's the guy who has to make the call, and here's the call he made: crucify.
I think personally, the reason why he made that call is when the chief priest said, we have no king but Caesar. That was a zinger.
Oh, yeah, it was.
I mean, that was
What?
putting the.
Thank you for saying that. I think you're exactly right, because in essence, they're saying, we're loyal to Caesar. Aren't you loyal to Caesar?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, but Pilate's not an idiot.
No.
I mean, he could have easily at that point totally put them in their place.
Yes.
Because all of their Sabbath and all that has nothing to do with Caesar.
Yes.
If you're only king of Caesar, why are you doing all of this every weekend, and all that? He could have easily just put them in their place.
Sure
But
could
it
have.
wasn't meant to be. There's several reasons, but he had a way out and he chose not to.
Thank you. That's the very point I want to make. He did have a way out. He chose not to. And as best we can tell, it's because he really felt the pressure. Because it would have lose my job.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, you know
Well,
what?
if that statement got to Caesar, obviously he'd be in trouble, even though
Yeah.
this, you know,
Yeah.
Caesar's, they're not going to go through and look at, okay, let me look at all the witness statements here. No. They just hear something like that, and like, yeah, you're done.
Yeah. Okay, it was a pledge on their part. They're willing to sell their soul for whatever works to get what they want. So they're making a pledge to Caesar. It's put down to Pilate. It's also the thing that pushes him over the edge. So he makes the decision to hand him over to be crucified. They took Jesus, therefore, and went out bearing his own cross. It's just amazing that after the flogging, he's able to do this. Well, we know that he wasn't able to do this. When it says bearing his own cross, it was a typical practice, and this is where the movies get goofed up sometimes, because you always see Jesus bearing the full cross, but the typical practice, as far as we know, is just bearing the cross piece.
Right up on your
Yeah.
shoulders,
But
probably
even-
strapped to you.
Yeah, but even that in his condition, they're going to have to, the soldiers are going to get Simon to help him carry it, because he cannot carry the weight on his own. How many soldiers did he hand him over to take him? We're going to find out in a minute. That probably four soldiers. That's typically what happened here, because Jesus has 5 pieces of clothing. And so what do you do with the 5th piece of clothing?
Draw lines.
Yeah, cast lots for it. And John's going to get down there in just a few minutes. Anyway, they went out bearing his own cross to a place, the place they called it. They called it the place of the skull, which in Hebrew is Golgotha. Golgotha means skull. So this is another place where John's just translating it for his readers who may not have Hebrew background, so they can understand this. This is, again, something that just really made an impression on me when I got to go to the Holy Land trip. They took us to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where a lot of church tradition believes that Jesus was crucified there. And it's, I don't want to get off on this, but the thing that so impressed me about, not in a positive way, that made such an impression on me about the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is, first of all, how ornate it was. How humans can just make a big ornate thing over everything. You know what I mean? It's so ornate. the second thing that gets, you can look this up online and see this. Church of Holy Sepulchre, at that time, I think was split 5 ways. But it's like the old classic shows where somebody can't get along with somebody else, they paint a line down the middle of the room. That's what this building is. It's divided, it's owned by different religious groups. And so there's all sorts of politicking going on all the time. They all occupy the same place because they think it's the place where Jesus was crucified. That's the traditional site. Well, our tour guide was telling us that, yeah, that's what they think because tradition says that. But the archaeologists and a lot of good evidence says, no, it wasn't there. Book of Hebrews tells us he was killed outside, taken outside. Well, you look just outside the north wall of the ancient city of Jerusalem, and you'll see a place, and I can still remember this, and it was a bus station down below, but there was a hill, the side of the hill, you know how rocky places, they'll have little crevices, and it looks like, well, it's not a cave, but it goes in a little bit. I tell you what, the side of the hill has 2 of those right there. It looks like a skull. It just looks like a skull. You look over from this vantage point, it's like, you know, I'm no archaeologist, but that looks like a skull right over there. And sure enough, they go over there, and there's a place close to it, and we're going to find out that the place where they're going to bury his body is close to where he was crucified. So the place of the skull, and close by this place for the tomb, it all just kind of fits, but it's not the traditional site, and which is kind of neat because you don't have these big ornate Catholic church buildings built on top of it. You can actually see, you know.
Thank goodness they didn't get the rest. Kind of like Indiana Jones, right, where they're looking in the wrong place.
Yes. Okay, so they take him to the place of the skull, to Golgotha. There they crucified him, and with him 2 other men, one on either side of him, and Jesus was in between. Okay, we started with something very gruesome with the flogging. We're going to end with something very gruesome, but I want to point out again, the Bible's just very curt here. It just says they crucified. The crucifixion was, I think everybody knows this, but there are some details to the crucifixion that maybe you don't. I don't have to go into a lot of detail on this, but number one, there's some controversy because some religious groups about the cross. Some people think it was an impaling instead of just a pole. Well, we do have a lot of information about the cross. Sometimes they use an X. Sometimes they use something that looks like the capital T. Other times they use the traditional cross. But the Romans, it was much, much earlier. It would be the Medes and the Persians where this was first started. They did just start with a pole back then. But the Romans usually used an X or the T or the cross. And the reason that we go with the traditional view of the cross the way it is because he has a sign above his head. Yeah. And so the other 2 just don't lend themselves to that. And so the traditional view of the cross and the fact that he carried the cross piece probably makes a lot of sense. But some of the other details that we know that would go along with the crucifixion, yes, he was nailed, probably not in the palm of the hand because it would rip right out, probably by the wrist, which is acceptable. They would use the term hand to refer to that. But a lot of times there would the nailing of the feet, they would twist your body sideways so they could nail one nail through both feet so the body would be twisted there. Sometimes there would be a little protrusion for you to not slide down so it would hold you up. And a lot of times they would take a rope and put it around your midsection to hold you against it because they didn't want you falling off the cross or ripping off the cross. They wanted you there in a twisted position, and you were naked. You were naked.
The Romans started the seat thing because they wanted people to suffer longer.
Yes.
And they found that if you didn't put that seat, that they all slumped and things broke and they fell down.
Yes.
So they wanted the Romans came up with the seat, from what I understand.
Yes.
To make the suffering all night longer.
Yeah. And some of these details are not included for us. In fact, it's, again, the authors are just, they crucified him. And I do think the emphasis, and this is where we're gonna pick up next week, I think we ought to put the emphasis on this, on spiritually what is going on here, more than just the physical. But the physical is a reality, and it's reality that people in the first century did not have to have explained to them, because it was probably burned in their memories.
Yeah, and just going back to the physical, sorry about that.
Yeah, no,
They dug up an archaeological dig and found a nail through the feet.
like that with the two of them at the same, yeah.
Yes. They have found that because that was one of the big things. It's all, they did not use nails. This came out and they said, and it was around 60.
Yeah.
60. So,
You know, I read in the news today, they found Pilot's Road. Pilot's Road. And it's a major, I mean, they have speculation, but they have, the news was they have really good proof of it. It was just released today in the news, and it's a 700-foot road outside of Jerusalem that leads to the temple. And it would be a major road, not just a walking path. And one of the things that they found on it that they found during their dig was they found some Roman coins. And Roman coins are one of the best ways to date things, because you've got, you know when this thing was minted. And another part of this that I found fascinating was they said the reason the coins are so good, because you would think, well, that only puts a limit on one side, right? Because you can have a coin that was minted in the year 20, but you could have that today, right? So you've only put a bookend on this side. But they say, oh no, because a little bit later, they minted so many more coins that they constantly are finding coins around 60 and 70. And so since they didn't find any of those coins, but some earlier coins, they're able to put bookends on this. And so this road dates back, this Pilot's Road dates back to pretty close to the time of the crucifixion. Back in, that's why they call it Pilot's Road. Anyway, I find those archaeology things very fascinating. Any other questions, comments? We'll pick up here, verse 19 next week. Thank you for sharing. I appreciate that. Let's pray. Gracious Heavenly Father, thank